Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg, the founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News, and of course, our sister site, All Arab News. I'm really glad to be joined today by David Makovsky, a former official in various U.S. government posts, including as an advisor to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Currently, he is a fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the premier Middle East think tank based obviously in Washington. He is also the author of a fascinating new book that we're going to talk about. Well, not so new, but in a year of 2020, I can still consider it new. Be Strong and of Good Courage. This is a book that goes into a fascinating look at four Israeli prime ministers who really made critical decisions to change the course of the state of Israel, both to protect it and to expand U.S.-Israeli relations and peace in the region. And David wrote that with his colleague at the Washington Institute, former U.S. Ambassador Dennis Ross, who worked for multiple U.S. administrations, going back to George W. Bush and President Obama and Vice President Biden, but also back to the Clinton-Gore years. And in the next program, we're going to talk about the podcast that David is hosting, roughly about 30 minutes or so each time. It's called Decision Points. It has become my favorite podcast, and we are going to talk about it in depth in the next program. But I want to get into this book, David. First of all, thank you for joining us on All Israel News.
Delighted to be with you, Joel. Thank you again for having me.
My pleasure. So this is a great book, and I loved it. And what's interesting to me is that you and Dennis did not try to cover all of Arab-Israeli history. You certainly could, and in many of your other books, you and Dennis, I think I've read a lot of them, not all. You guys have covered different elements. But looking at David Ben-Gurion, of course, the founder of the state of Israel, Menachem Begin, totally different on the other end of the political spectrum from David Ben-Gurion, on the right of the spectrum, and a pariah for a long time in Israel and the world, but makes the first peace treaty with an Arab country. Totally, I mean, what a game changer. Nobody saw that coming. Yitzhak Rabin, a warrior as well as a peacemaker, both making peace with Jordan and the Oslo Accords, but giving his life for it. And of course, Ariel Sharon, who, as one of my Palestinian friends says, was probably the poster child of evil in the Palestinian world, and yet ends up not only being a great military hero for Israel, but pulls all of Israel out of Gaza, gives the entire Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. And what a game-changing moment. People see it differently, but it's a fascinating moment in Israel's history. So I think I want to focus first on Rabin. Well, no. I want to cover all of them, but we've got 10 minutes. So let's actually start with Menachem Begin, because there's the first case of going against type, right? We have someone who was either a freedom fighter or a terrorist, depending on one's perspective. And yet, here he is at Camp David. The CIA assessment of Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin was that their personalities should never be alone in the room together. I don't think you guys had that. I think that's from Lawrence Wright's book, 13 Days in September. But that's how the book begins, and I was like, wow, that is striking. I think it was true. Talk to us about Menachem Begin and how he got to the point where he could make a decision that he had sworn he would never do, which was give away the Sinai.
Right. So I think you're right. And look, with all these leaders, what defines them was a sense of national responsibility, country first. And even that meant also exhibiting political courage against even dealing with their own allies, as you point out, his own views. Begin, by the way, said that he was, he didn't want to ever give up the settlements. He had made different statements about the Sinai, though. But ultimately, Carter wanted him to give up the Sinai and the West Bank together, and he rejected that. But on the Sinai, he would have to be evacuating these 2,000 settlers. And at the end of the day, he saw that if you could get Egypt out of the circle of war, without Egypt, the other Arab countries would not be able to wage war alone. He thought this was a historic opportunity that could not be missed. And he weighed the risks of action versus the risks of inaction. What if I don't decide? What happens to me then? And I think he really believed that if Sadat could go back to the rejectionist camp. And I remember the speech. I was reading the speech that he gave after defending Camp David. And he said, by any moral code, if I can save lives, we've had wars, 48, 56, 67, 73. Remember, this is 78. The 73 war was not ancient history, right after Camp David. And the treaty is signed March 79. But, Israel lost close to 3,000 boys on the battlefield. And he felt, if I could save lives, this is the greatest religious virtue. We call the book Be Strong and of Good Courage because it comes from the Bible, because that's God's injunction to leadership, to be strong. Because in the Middle East, if you're not strong, you're dead. It's a very tough region. But being strong is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to be wise also. So we don't see a dichotomy between strength and wisdom. We think they go together. And Begin, for us, personifies that. He took on his own comrades and the right, allies of his for many years. And he said, at the end of the day, what counts is I'll have stopped wars. And what people need to remember is he was vindicated. There were no wars with Egypt after the peace treaty of 78, 79. And it's been now 40 years.
Let me note,
and it's a great testament to Begin.
Yeah, well, that point I think is so important. Let's pull on that thread. He signs the peace treaty in March of 1979. 2 years later, he attacks Iraq and takes out the nuclear reactor at Osirak, which even the United States, the Reagan administration went crazy. They were furious. But what if he hadn't done it? And then the next year, he invades Lebanon. So though I'm not getting into all the issues of Lebanon right now. My point is that peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was tested severely, first with those two, but then you add the Intifada, you add other issues over time. That thing is held, and that is pretty impressive.
If I could add just generally, the first test was the death of Sadat himself. People said, you're making a deal with one man. What if he gets killed? He gets killed, but Egypt keeps its word. And clearly Sadat and Begin together, they really made this, this peace has survived both of them. 40 years now. If you look at I won't bore you with a lot of statistics, but if you look at the 70s, how much of Israel's budget had to go to the military? Over 40%. But once it ended the interstate wars, now it's under 5%. And that means more money for schools, for hospitals, for clinics, basic amenities of modern life. And so the peace that he built was a very solid foundation that is with us, thankfully, to this very day.
Well, I love that section. I love the podcast on Anwar Sadat as well. We don't have the time to get into it, but the first delegation that I had the opportunity to lead of evangelical leaders to meet with President El-Sisi, he suddenly realized during our meeting, oh, you need to go see Mrs. Sadat. That had not been on the agenda. His people call, can they have tea? And we went from the palace, wow, Mrs. Sadat's home, the very home where her husband had plotted the attack in 73, and the peace offensive that was just a game changer, right? So, all right, so now Yitzhak Rabin. Now, it's interesting to me, his story, and particularly you guys, you and Dennis deal with the Oslo Accords. You don't actually deal much, almost at all, with the peace treaty with Jordan. by contrast, and you do in a podcast. But it is interesting because the king of Jordan, King Hussein, didn't even know this back channel was happening with the Palestinians. Rabin himself was skeptical of it. It was sort of a Shimon Peres, or you kind of run that. And those two were politically in the same camp, but they were not the same personalities or temperaments in any way. And the king didn't know. And yet, Rabin really pulls off two very dramatic moments. Talk a little bit about how he got there.
Right. Well, on the Jordan Peace Treaty, I'm sorry to promote. I know we're going to talk separately about podcasts, but I mean, I was like on the verge of my seat. I couldn't believe it. The former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, talks about the behind the scenes.
And the former crown prince, Prince Hassan, the brother of the king.
And I interviewed Prince Hassan and Amman right before COVID. I got to see him. And in Amman at his palace. I mean, but we didn't pick the Jordan Treaty only not because we didn't think it was important. That was very important. But we were looking for cases where people sometimes had to go against their base. Yeah. And that's why Jordan was a very consensus-oriented treaty. So we didn't feel that if we had to limit ourselves to four, that's why we didn't choose it. But it wasn't because we thought it was not important. It's just the opposite, very important. And again, I hope the people hear the podcast, and it's very dramatic what went on. Indeed. But with Rabin, I think, he was someone who was, above all, I covered him as a journalist. He was very proud of his intellectual honesty. He felt that, I had won the 67 war. I was the general who won the war. But my job is to secure Israel, that it remains, the twin engines of Zionism, that it's both the Jewish state and that it's a democratic state. And he felt that meant partitioning of the land. And he was very, when he felt the strategy didn't work, like he was hoping, well, I'll just deal with the West Bank Palestinians, Saeb Erekat, Hanan Ashrawi. And then he said, well, wait a while. Our intel is showing they don't move their pencil without getting permission from Tunis, from where Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO. So he said, okay, that's not going to work. I wrote a book on Oslo, on Israeli decision-making there. But he basically felt that the macro situation of the U.S. winning the Cold War against the Soviet Union, some would say, look, if you're strong, you don't have to compromise. But others would say, yeah, but if you're weak, you can't afford to compromise. And Rabin's view is, then when do you compromise? He felt you make compromises when you're at the peak of your strength. And with the Soviet Union dissolving itself, and all of the radicals and the Arab world who got their support from the Soviets were weakened. And Arafat himself, by the way, was weakened because he picked the wrong side of the Gulf War. Right, with Saddam in Iraq. So he felt that, like, okay, you're cash in your chips at the peak and safeguard Israel's security. That's what you're there for. And it took enormous courage. And Dennis Ross and I have voiced our criticisms of time to time, on the Palestinians too, since Oslo, to put it mildly. But I think the idea of partition, and people could have honest disagreements about this, but I think Rabin was motivated by a love of country, by a belief on what is good for Israel in the long run. And that really drove him to do what he did. Believe me, if you looked at his face, I was there on the White House lawn on September 13th, and you saw the angst in his face. He did not look forward to shaking Yasser Arafat's hand whatsoever. But he said, I'm not there as a private person. I'm here to secure the state of Israel, and Israel's, to remain Jewish and democratic, it's got to have to, agree to partition. But it took a lot of enormous strength, and he ultimately paid for it with his life.
Well, sadly, we're out of time because the rest of the book is so interesting. You deal where I thought I was going to go at first, but then I had to deal with the others. Arik Sharon, who, one of the things I think was so fascinating about this in the book and the podcast, because you end up talking to his former chief of staff, the head of his bureau, and so forth. But it's so interesting that Arik Sharon decided, I'm not going to leave to generations that weren't there at the founding of the country the security architecture that he believed was his responsibility. Now, people can disagree. Obviously, Netanyahu was opposed, Natan Sharansky. I actually worked for both of them as they opposed it in the summer and fall of 2000. But you took me and with Dennis inside his thinking. Listen, we're not here forever. We don't want Gaza. There's no reason to be there. I'm not waiting. We're making the decision. Why don't you close with a final thought about that, even though we're over time?
Look, I think what's unique about all these leaders, what's common to them, I should say, as you pointed out in the beginning, Ben-Gurion and Begin didn't even speak to each other. There's so many differences, but they had this sense of national responsibility. You don't defer your problems to the successors, to your kids' generation. That's why you're in the chair. You're in the chair not for power, not for photo ops. You're in the chair to take tough calls. Mm-hmm. And these leaders, were people who didn't take the state for granted, and they felt the responsibility on their shoulders. They knew how precarious it is. It's interesting that Ben-Gurion and Begin were born in Poland, and they saw their job as to end Jewish victimhood after 2,000 years of wandering. But the newer generation of Rabin and Sharon were both generals born in the land who wanted to consolidate the state, but also believed it lived on a knife's edge, and that they did not have luxuries to just say, oh, well, that's too tough. Let the next guy deal with it. That to me was one of the things that really spoke to me. And that's why we picked the biblical phrase, be strong and of good courage, because we see these leaders as embodiment of a belief that don't take the existence of the state of Israel for granted. You might have to make tough calls, but you have one goal, and the goal is to secure the state for generations to come.
Well, I can't more highly recommend, so let me say that in a positive. I highly recommend this book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, by David Makovsky and Dennis Ross. Whether it's a Hanukkah present, whether it's a Christmas present, whether it's just the next read, I bought it for history and making notes in hardcover, but I also listened to it on audio, which is one of the things I love to do. And for people who say, "Oh, I'm too busy to read a book," just get it on your phone, on your next flight, on your next drive to the supermarket, to get gas, whatever it is. It's a great way to move through leadership. And it's really about leadership. And David, thank you for being with All Israel News and talking about this extraordinary book.
Thank you so much for having me.